world. Welcome back to another episode of Practicing Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. My name's Sarah, and I'm here with my friend Lizelle. And today we're going to be talking about episode 26, which is just called Cognitive Science. So, this whole episode was a description of cognitive science. And as we usually do, I'm going to pass it over to Lizelle to get us started with a quote.
Hello, world. I still managed to stick with my promise to stick to Socrates. I am reading really slowly because I'm trying to read the Greek as well. So there might be weeks that I haven't made any progress in Plato, but I have some today. So I'm still reading from Meno, and Anita says, there's so much interesting, but I can't go into it because I'm also doing character studies of the characters, and it's just so fascinating. But that's a different program that we can go into one day. So he says, I suppose they in their turn learned it. He's talking about being virtuous or being a good man. Learned it from forebears who were gentlemen like themselves. Would you deny that there have been many good men in our city? Socrates responds. On the contrary, there are plenty of good statesmen here in Athens, and have been as good in the past. The question is, have they also been good teachers of their own virtue? That is the point we are discussing now. Not whether or not there are good men in Athens, or whether there have been in the past times, but whether virtue can be taught. It amounts to the question whether the good men of this and former times have known how to hand on to someone else the goodness that was in themselves, or whether, on the contrary, it is not something that can be handed over, or that one man can receive from another. That is what Meno and I have been puzzling over. Then he continues into, it made me think of Marcus Aurelius, because we talked about his bad son. And he goes into the same thing, how really good men can have really bad sons, even though they spend a fortune on educating them, because virtue seems to be something quite elusive. That where does it come from? How do we have it? Can we be taught how to be virtuous? Can virtue be cultivated?
Huh. I like this because, of course, with the topic of this episode, I was replacing that word with cognition, virtue. Yeah, or cognition is the way by which virtue is attained.
That is part of the other part of Meno is cognition, a way of how a virtue is knowledge. Is virtue knowledge, or is it something else?
Okay, well, we're jumping ahead. We're using our cognitive science. The beginning of this, of course, as it always is a recap of last episode. So he goes into, I think you nice and succinctly said, recap of the clash. Perfect. So yeah, just that idea of those two different geists coming together in this big titanic war. And yeah, so now we're going to be moving into the cognitive science part of this series where we're going to be, walking through how all of those events had some sort of maybe impact on the way that our brains and minds work.
So what he's trying to move into now is he says, like, we are stuck in the middle. We and he says almost exactly the same words as he said last time. We are trapped. We can't do nostalgia. We can't do utopia, and yet we need something that will systematically create psychotechnologies that transform consciousness, cognition, character, and culture in a way that religions have done in the past. So we lost the whole up to here was like there was meaning created in the axial age and then in different religions. We lost that. And then that was like, how did we lose it? Why did you lose it? because this dude killed the universe, this dude killed the human soul. There was a lot of killing going on. And now it's like, okay, but we need this. So we need to make, you know, we need to make these create these psychotechnologies. And how can we best do it? And he says, basically, I think the best way to do it is to understand the machinery that makes it. And how do we understand the machinery that makes it? By looking through a cognitive science lens.
Yeah.
So that's what we're now going to do. We're going to look at these meaning making machinery, he calls it. And then, of course, later he refines it a bit. But we're going to look at that and see how do we go forward, type of thing.
Okay, just some notes that I have. We're framing this not politically, but instead attempting to scientifically understand that meaning making machinery and what cognitive processes are at work within that meaning making machinery. And another thing he mentions here is that science or the scientific worldview is part of the problem. And I don't know exactly at what point he goes into this. It's kind of when he starts to talk about fragmentation. But I don't know, it might be worth mentioning up front too that the reason that we're taking this cognitive science approach is because science is part of the problem. Science trying to explain everything factually and not in a participatory way is part of the problem. So yeah, not framing this politically, but also not forgetting where we've gone. Like we went secular, and that's just going to be a part of this equation now. There's no way to eliminate that. You know, we can nostalgically return to religions for the purposes of maybe reigniting some of that meaning making machinery too. But yeah, taking into full consideration that science is a part of this resolution because it kind of threw the wrench in it all.
The problem is, once we've been disillusioned, which many people have been in religions, going back to that is severe self bullshitting.
Mhm.
It's you have to somehow lie to yourself even once you've been disillusioned to put your blindfolds back on.
Yeah.
So that's why he says it's not really a viable option for many people. Right? You can't go back to seeing how you used to see once your eyes have changed. So we need a new way of seeing. So let's look at this machinery that helps us see, in the big sense of the word see, making sense of, and see how we can cultivate a new way maybe.
Right. There's that meta perspective that we can take with this as opposed to having to be inside of one of those old traditions. All right. So, all right. Some of the things that he says here is different disciplines using different methods and different ontologies. A lot of different disciplines that are looking at the brain and the mind from different perspectives.
Levels of reality.
Mm.
And the brain is one level of this mind. It's looking at the mind more than at the brain, because the brain is just one level of that he's mentioning in this levels of reality. And he doesn't use the word emergence and emanation here, but he does keep saying that there's some sort of relationship between all of these levels. And the fragmentary way that science is operating at the moment doesn't do justice to this relationship between the levels. And later, when he starts to talk more about the levels of reality apart from cognitive science, in other videos and other series, he starts using this idea of emergence and emanation. So things emerge bottom up, but there's also an emanation taking place from top down. And it's a simultaneous thing that's happening. There's like interaction, influence, causal activity on each level, up and down, both ways. And we're not doing justice to that if we just separate the disciplines and, don't look at how do they relate, what is the patterns that's emerging or emanating within.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense because in holistic medicine, I was mentioning how like otherwise with allopathic medicine, or especially with modern medicine in the States, you have different specialists that cover different body parts. One doctor is working on the heart while one works on the kidney, even though in the body those two systems are talking with one another, the cardiovascular and the endocrine system. They're interacting with one another, but when you don't look at them at the full body perspective, and not to say those doctors aren't trained on that, that's the weird part, is they know these things. So in that sense, yeah, they could all potentially interact and exchange information. They just we fragmented the body.
That's one of the curses of the blessing of so much knowledge. We have so much knowledge, which is valuable. I love knowledge. It's like one of my biggest passions in life is knowledge. But I think it's John that said somewhere that Thomas Aquinas could read every single book of philosophy ever written by his time. There's no way anyone can do that now. There's just too much. There's so much now that we know about the human body that if someone really wants to understand any part, you kind of, forced into specialization. You, if you want something, if you want everything, you have to be a jack of, master of none. Like, what is that?
Yeah.
Jack of all trades, master of none. If you want to be a master of something, you have to specialize. And maybe, I don't know, maybe if you're like
It
John,
seems
you don't have to, but
well,
for normal people.
for some reason, like when you have that ability to specialize, you can also apply that. It's juxtaposed onto different disciplines. So it's like there's something to becoming very specialized and having the ability to make those patterns work for something else. And I think that that's the thing, that's a distinction that we're going to get to here in the cognitive sciences, and being like especially attuned to one of these cognitive sciences that it's not real, by the way, I should say. But yeah, so like people thinking that they're operating as one of the cognitive sciences,
Yeah.
being very specialized in that one thing, but not necessarily being able to zoom out to cognitive science, as
Mm.
we're like going to be describing as kind of a entity,
Mm.
not small little psychology, linguistics, and all of these cognitive sciences. It's a big, yeah, over meta perspective of those individual sciences.
That's what John is arguing for, indeed.
Yeah.
The one that he's arguing for, that it's cognitive science should be some sort of meta science.
Without the equivocation. So maybe we should just like move into it then, since I'm falling into confusion here.
Yeah, let's talk about equivocation. Because I was just about to Google what does equivocation mean, and then he said like, what equivocation mean is, and I was like, yes, I don't have to Google.
So what did you have then? What did you put down?
To equivocal is to fall into confusion because you don't keep track of the meaning of your terms. So you make it mean the same thing, and then he goes into that peanut butter and jelly sandwich example. And he gives really bad advice. If you're going to follow John's advice, do not follow this advice.
Oh, that was
Which
like, that's
a really good peanut butter and jelly sandwich. I mean,
no, very poetic. Nice metaphor.
we need to integrate without equivocation. So these we need to integrate these levels without equivocation, and then he gets to what he thinks, and then philosophy adds as a very important discipline within this whole, because that's the one that makes us stand back and look at all of them and their interaction and how they relate to each other. Um, yeah, and then we get into the three views, because he says like different people see cognitive science differently, and then he goes into the three ways that people see it, and
Okay.
then the one he prefers.
So like in a sense, you're kind of starting to understand with this how philosophy and the disciplines interact with one another. Okay, so yeah, that already meta perspective of the brain trying to understand itself.
Maybe you should say the mind trying to understand
The
itself.
mind trying to understand itself. Okay, yeah. So then you have cognitive science,
Yeah.
cognition trying to understand itself, or mind trying to understand cognition, something like that. Okay.
Trying to cognicize cognition or something like that.
All that to say, like, there's the need to keep the perspective separate. I think that's kind of why my mind really wants to emphasize this, because of that idea of equivocation. Like, cognitive science isn't just philosophy. And those terms, maybe in cognitive science, probably won't be the same as the terms of philosophy or any of the sciences involved in it.
Yeah, they use different terms and different methods. And yeah. So the first way he says people look at it sometimes is they make it plural and uncapitalized. So then the cognitive sciences, and then a neuroscientist would say, I work within the cognitive sciences as a neuroscientist. And that he will think, okay, this is the umbrella term, and I'm one of the little men standing underneath the umbrella. But that's all. That's all. There's no need for integration or anything from that perspective. Just seeing it as the generic nominalism or the genus. That's the first. He doesn't spend a lot of time on that, or at least I didn't write a lot down. He's clearly not subscribing to that view.
And then there's the other one that's interdisciplinary eclecticism, which is kind of like interfaith dialogue. And we were talking earlier, and he even mentions in the episode that this isn't an attempt to get people on your side about something.
It's interfaith dialogue. I was part of it when I was at the university. It's basically to stop the world from fighting. It's a way of peace negotiation type of thing. So that's why I said it's a good thing. Because in the past, a lot of people killed each other because they believed differently, and not even outside of faiths, even within a faith. I mean, we talked about the revolution, the Reformation. But so that's interfaith. They're trying to get an understanding and appreciation, but they're not trying to take on the other's view. And he says this is if you see just as interdisciplinary eclecticism, cognitive science with capital letter and just like not pluralized, but not really not trying to make something above and beyond. That's what this is. They're just nice to each other. Yeah.
It's almost like not trying to build a bridge, but having a boat that goes out to each of the islands. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, that's good, because you're not establishing something new. You're just shouting at each other like over the river, maybe like yeah.
And it almost seems like, yeah, you can be out of sight from, because we were talking about projectiles earlier, and so just continuing with that example, like that idea could be completely out of sight for me, but I could go visit with it, but I can definitely leave it. And it's just like a vacation. It's not me going.
And it's irrelevant to your own way of being and your point of view. It's not going to change your point of view or your. And this is also, John says, this is also not what we want with cognitive science.
Cognitive sciences. So in that example would be like the psychologist can visit the linguistics island, but then could return back to psychology land.
And maybe you'll incorporate a small little thing, but it's not drastically going to influence how you think about the brain, for instance.
Because the idea is still that my way is the right way.
Yes, and that you also really experience in interfaith dialogue. That, like, because I've been part of it, I know that the theory is you're not trying to convert everyone, and no one explicitly does. But this whole attitude, like, well, this is true. This happens to be true. This is what I believe. So what you believe can't really be true, but I'm not going to say that because that's not nice. I'm going to smile and nod politely, and that's about it. And because we want peace. That's the one thing we have in common. We want peace. Yeah.
Okay, so that's two different kinds. Those are interesting. Like, interesting to look at the contrast of seeing yourself as a small part of a bigger role with that lowercase cognitive sciences, or seeing yourself in this like very astute position and going to see the other plebes just to maintain some harmony. And then there's this way of synoptic integration which is building a bridge, multiple bridges, maybe even like a full infrastructure of, okay, we need to be exchanging information, we need to be exchanging goods, and this should be a yeah, multi-directional pathway.
Building a Silk Road comes to mind. Creating the path. Oh yeah. What is that thing that we talked about? Dia Eros, desire paths.
Yeah.
But making paths, like actually, that
Yeah, dealing with the fragmentation, addressing the equivocation and ignorance.
we need to, is exactly what is, we need to build something between the disciplines that addresses the equivocation, deals with the fragmentation, and fills in the ignorance. Knowing we are one, but we are many. They are not saying the same thing, but they're not simply saying different things either. What he's basically saying is we happen to be in luck because this program of synoptic integration, we're hardwired for that. Since the new upper Paleolithic transition, we've been thinking in metaphor. We're hardwired for this, being able to bridge domains, being able to see the difference and yet see the similarities at the same time. And then it goes into metaphor. It's not an identity claim. It alters, but it is important that it should alter what I consider salient. It's a balance between the identity and the difference, would be an apt metaphor. And then he keeps calling, it's so scientific, an apt metaphor. And then he keeps calling the other ones, that's a crappy metaphor. So that's a crappy metaphor.
Yeah. So yeah, really highlighting here then the things that we were building all in the first half of this series, which was metaphor, and our brains working really well with, like in the shaman example, in all these the cave drawings, like all these parables, they make sense.
So since we're now only on screen when we speak, I'm going to see while I hold up the book. I think it's mostly referring to this book when they talk about how we use metaphors like I grasp it, which is actually a metaphor, that acceptation of actual distances, actual things, and to make it symbolic or yeah. And then this was, we've talked, you mentioned the cave dwellings. There's this book that he might be referring back to. And there's something of this in this as well, because our ability to think metaphorically is very much probably a base for our ability to experience spiritual reality.
That's nice because that like makes spiritual a different word when you say metaphor.
Well, we're going to get to imaginal way of being, imaginal space, imaginal reality, which is in a sense metaphoric.
Mm-hmm. Just going back to the example of projectile and how like that's part of the language is that like we can throw things, we can grasp things. We were talking about just vocabulary, and I mean that's very metaphorical. The projectile was part of that because what was it? Neanderthal had the ability to go in and confront the fight, but then humans, what is it called?
Probably just some sort of homo. Probably just
Homo
homo.
erectus. They're all standing. Whatever. The one that came after, one of them is going into the battle with the boar because this seems like the only way to get my kill. And then you have this development of this psychotechnology of, it's just developing the spear and throwing the spear.
It's a physical technology which we exapted into a psychotechnology.
Yeah. So like our brain clearly functions the way that we operate in the world. The patterns come from how we exchange with our world. So if that, that being the case with Neanderthal going in, brute force, I got to kill it with a rock or whatever the hell, versus I'm going to launch this thing. And in order to launch the sphere, I first have to make the sphere in a way that it can be. So I'm very intimately engaged with this sphere just in its creation. And then I've got to figure out, okay, now when I launch it, what's the trajectory that it needs to take in order to, hit something far away from me. And that takes a lot of skill and honing in on that ability to do that thing and all these different moving parts where when I throw something, I don't think about it. When I throw a ball or something like that, when I catch a ball, like there's nothing, I just know what this feels like. So it becomes just like a full body experience. And now when we come to life as a metaphor, and Sam is a pig, and my association with pig is how we're going to be able to make sense of that metaphor. Your understanding of pig is how we're going to make sense of that metaphor. So like you're saying, like if there was no understanding that pig in this context meant someone that's sexually lustful and going after a bunch of partners. I'm so fucking scientific. Like, why can't I just say shit? I don't know. But yeah, there's in that just like understandings of those words that has to be clear before you can even get the meaning of the sentence. So anyway,
Yeah.
I went
It's that projectile, if to hit the mark, to get the metaphor that's apt. You can't just throw it like bloop, drop it close by. You're not going to hit the mark. And you can't throw it too far because you're not going to hit the mark. And we seem to have some sort of ability to know intuitively how far we need to throw it to hit the mark. And some metaphors are apt, and we know, yeah, this is hitting the mark. There's enough similarity, there's enough differences to provide a new insight. And some are just so far that you have to really think about it in order to make sense of it. So maybe someone who has very practicing this throwing skill will sometimes throw, metaphors out there that everyone else is like, what? And that might be an interesting, ability to have, because it has the potential of, like, bees or hornets are never going to provide you with new insights, but one that's thrown too far could potentially, give you an aha moment. But so if you're going to
it's almost like throwing it too far is causing the rug pull. Like the sphere is like attached to the rug, and if you throw it too far, you just have nothing that you're standing on, which is fine. But that rug got attached to that string, and now you've got to go out there and find something to stand on. Otherwise, you're just kind of suspended in the abyss, over the abyss. And that is a place to be, but yeah, it's scary.
But yeah, your fine reminded me of Ross of Friends. There's like a meme of him as well. It's fine. I'm fine. It's that type of fine. It's
fine. Totally fine. I don't know why it's coming out all loud and squeaky, because really, I'm fine.
Just keep breathing. Whoa. Sometimes I feel like I've mental flossed when I have an idea. That felt like mental flossing. So that's a question. That is a question that we're coming to, is how to know whether we're doing this well or badly. And we kind of just described a way you could do this very badly, which is to just launch it so far that you can't fucking see it anymore. And now you gotta figure out how to go get it. So then there's that, he's very adamant about making this distinction about what plausible could mean.
He says, let's not say, because that it does mean it in one sense, but he says, I'm not going to go with that meaning. Is high probability. It's plausible means it's high probability, but we're not going for that it's high probability. We're going for it's reasonable. It's making good sense. It's deserving of to be taken seriously. That is plausible.
Yeah, like it isn't the truth, but it's hopefully guiding us closer to truth.
Yeah. He later comes to, it doesn't mean it's true. It means it's reasonable and should be taken seriously. That's what it means. When he says profound, I think that's where we're going to end up. I do feel like I have no notes, but I feel like we skipped something. We're missing a bridge, but I don't know what the bridge is. Oh, okay. All right. Okay. Yeah. Elegance is multi-aptness. So he's going now into indeed. So it's part of the, so thinking metaphorically helps us to see the differences and the similarities, see from and through the differences in an insightful and meaningful way.
Which is really important because he's saying here that there are many convergent independent lines of data that can allow something to be more trustworthy. Mm-hmm. So keeping them separate but seeing how they can all converge is important for the multi-aptness, to recognize that multi-aptness and to get us towards elegance.
Yes. That is beautiful. I don't think he actually made that link, but it feels like this is the link that could easily be like, that is the, if you have a good or profound scientific view of, that perspective on cognitive science, and then it should have this convergence, which and elegance. And that is what we're aiming at. Yeah, I think that's the right bridge. I think that's how it
all I
we got
wrote down from what he said was bias reduction, many convergent independent lines of data. He spends a moment talking about how you can reduce bias by having multiple ways in which you can receive the produced side of this.
So it's the produced and the used. And the use, you wanted to have elegance, be multi-apt, and then on the convergent side, you want that as many senses as possible, for instance.
So then he moves into, because there's equivocating, there's also this ability to say, no, that's not actually what I said. Because I was actually coming from this angle, and therefore that statement is still true. Like you can, gaslight essentially.
But I just want to highlight it as well. Like if you have like this multiple channels, this convergence, you reduce this bias reduction, and which is really important for avoiding bullshit. And I think we'll get to that more in the future, which means it has trustworthiness. Again, doesn't mean it's true, but it's more trustworthy because comes from many channels.
Like it's reminding me of trust the science, when all the science was converging on one idea, and this was this idea of the pandemic as it played out. But what was the general narrative was, we need to isolate from one another, we need to wear masks, and so, but then like the people that were like really believing in that in one way or another, I don't care, but the people that were really adamant about that, it was like, trust the science says this. And as a scientist, and many scientists made this point of like, science isn't just like a thing, it's a method, it's always evolving and always happening.
In the Netherlands, they were very explicit about it. It was like, as far as we know now, from what we can tell, and this thing hasn't been long, so we can't tell that much, this and this is better than this and this. So we're going to try to do this and this and see what happens. This is part of the experiment. We were all part of the experiment. If the government is honest with you, they will tell you, hey, you're part of our experiment. We're experimenting on you and see what happens, and seeing what happens. Because that is what science do. It experiments and see what happens. But there was no way. It was too new. It was too fresh. That it was no way that there could have been fixed answers already. They were searching for the answers, and our government was very explicit about that. A lot of people started asking these meaning crisis questions, for one thing. I work from home most of the time now. A lot of people do. Life has changed pretty drastically. So yeah, but it's so weird because we talk about it like it didn't happen, or like it's a long time ago. Or
if we can acknowledge that this is abuse when it's used improperly,
we generate a lot of elegance to bullshit, and we generate a lot of conversions for triviality, or we combine it into a deepity, which this book apparently talks about. I still need to read it. And then we get trivial and bullshit in one go. So what capable creatures we are, we human beings. We can make triviality and bullshit all in one. And then for some reason he mentions the Socratic project of having a rationality about what you care about, which made me think of what we always say, choose your loves. So apparently that's a Socratic project, so that's pretty cool. And he refers to this book when he says that. This book was an interesting read in the sense that he seemed to be saying the same thing over and over again. It's a very academic book. But basically what he's saying is we learn from experience and we learn from friends. That's the two things that he's saying. 175 pages to say that.
Yeah. I mean, when we first got into this episode, I thought, wow, we're spending a whole episode just describing what cognitive science is. What you said there was experience and friends. And it reminded me of like having the multi-aptness, being able to recognize that your friends and you don't have the same way of perceiving. But yeah, that friendship is what the overarching goal is, like, you know, maintaining the friendship while also maybe in some cases pursuing wisdom.
Well, apparently, and I experienced it as well, like we value the opinion of our friends highest than just strangers. And since we can't experience everything, so we can't only learn from practice, from experiencing what is valuable and what should I pursue, we also then listen to our friends and try things out that if a friend suggested, we might do it. And if a stranger suggested, we might think like, nah, what is, I'm not going to bother. That's what he means with learning from friends as well.
Okay, I have next that cognitive science wants to bring about profound synoptic integration that addresses equivocation, fragmentation, and ignorance.
That's exactly what I have next.
We've converged on something.
I do want to mention while we're recording as well how absolutely excited John becomes when he discovers a new scientist with theories that converges with his, because then it's like, oh, this makes it more plausible. It makes it more likely that we've got a point in what we're doing. So he gets super excited when he discovers someone who discovered independently of him something that he's also seen.
Yeah, he's describing this meaning cultivation as being between us and the world, which I think is interesting. We've talked a lot about projectiles and things being too far, things being too close. And then we get into this between us and the world.
Yeah, he wants to go into the cognitive science of meaning making / seeking. And then he has that interesting discussion on the cultivation of meaning, which is actually pretty profound in itself, although he hasn't actually had the profound, according to him, the profound thing, because it is such a difficult thing to explain to people when I talk about John's work. Because one tends to say it's about meaning making, but that just doesn't capture it. So this cultivation of meaning just feels so much more right, so much more, oh yeah, that's, now that I actually pay attention to the fact that he uses that word, it's kind of like it makes a lot more sense of all of his work when you see that it's not making meaning, it's cultivating meaning.
Yeah.
He's against this whole romantic idea. He says that we only have to put something inside of us, we have to put it on the world. And he's against the empiricist view that it's all in the world and we just have to absorb it. There's something in between. There's an interaction. The spirit is between the I and the thou. It's not the I or the thou, it's that which is between us. As Martin Buber would say. That's what he's talking about, and that's beautiful.
We don't just find it in the world, and we don't just make it either.
Yeah.
And so John says here he wants to exemplify synoptic integration, which we just talked about, and the creation of a plausible construct.
In other words, claiming he's going to present us with a profound theory.
Right.
But he says, hold on to your horses, because it's not going to sound profound yet. I'm just only going to start making the theory. You have to listen to the next episode too. If that's not a cliffhanger, then I don't know.
All right. I want to take that sentence apart. Wants to exemplify the synoptic integration, which, like you said, was building between the disciplines, because our brains are built for metaphor. So we're like really good at building bridges between the domains, and the creation of a plausible construct. Plausible with that meaning of the word being reasonable, making good sense, to be taken seriously.
You are intelligence now as well.
Because I need to understand what that profound statement that he's making is.
I think we will only understand it next week.
Okay.
He's building on the idea that we are general problem solvers, human beings are general problem solvers, which means we are intelligent.
I see.
Because he says that's what intelligence means. You are a general problem solver.
Okay.
And then he refers to two different couples or two people working together. And both have a Simon in it, but I can't remember who and it's different Simons, but I can't remember who the other people is. Go check John for references. And yeah, the one measures, because they are actually curious about human intelligence, and what they measure is general problem solving in humans. And the other group two wants to make, because they're working on artificial intelligence, but they're also focusing on this general problem solving abilities. So already there's some convergence, like from two very different angles, like psychology, measuring human behavior, and artificial intelligent people, making people. The one who works with information processing, like they're also doing the same thing when they think about intelligence. They're thinking about this problem solving thing. And then he goes into what does it mean to be a general problem solver? It means you are not a cup, I wrote.
That is, yes, I'm more capable than a cup.
That brings me back to again to the I thou thing, right? Because we talked then about being treated as a cup. So for some reason, Buber is. I should read some Buber tonight.
Yeah.
Yeah, but we are more than a cup.
Okay, so all right, that helps a lot actually. So there was this description of intelligence and ways that we can go about understanding intelligence, which I mean, in order to understand intelligence, you can test for someone's intelligence, you can test a group of people for their intelligence, and now you've got some sort of way to measure intelligence. And then there's that way of understanding intelligence through trying to build it, because when you're trying to do artificial, which that was probably totally unintended, like they're just like, oh, we've built a machine, no, maybe like the whole process, but as like a bystander, as somebody that's just watching this happen, of computer generated intelligence, artificial general intelligence, and thinking, oh, maybe we should think about how humans learn so that we could build that.
I think it's called reverse engineering. And I think we're going to get to that in a future episode. That's exactly what they did.
And then I like that mention of GPS, the general problem solving. It's called GPS.
Well, you have no idea how many of my problems have been solved by GPS.
No. All right. Would you like to expand on how intelligence is separate from knowledge then?
Yes. I think I first want to mention that intelligence is also different from being rational. And what you ultimately should care about is not how intelligent you are, but how rational you can become. Because intelligence is kind of fixed. Like I've heard people say it's not, but that's not true. Your IQ is fixed, but your rationality is not. And I mean, you want to improve yourself, so that's what you want to work on. And I also felt something when John said this. I felt some sort of sadness / calling type of thing, because John is very intelligent and he does speak as clearly as possible, but he still has a very intelligent audience. And if the Socratic project includes this becoming as rational as possible, then it feels to me like we almost need to be able to put in practice what he teaches without having to have all the knowledge, you know? That would be good. That sounds to me like that would be a really good part of the religion that is not a religion. Mm-hmm. Being able to teach people how to be rational and how to cultivate their rationality. not focusing on intelligence, because I think a lot of this communities are still very highly intelligent and intelligence focused. And then he says intelligence is also not knowledge, because you can say Susan has a lot of knowledge because she's capable of acquiring all the knowledge because she's intelligent. But so you can't equate them, because then you're just saying Susan has a lot of knowledge because she has a lot of knowledge. Right. And it is the ability to solve a problem that makes you that is intelligence. And then he goes into what is it to solve a problem, and I think this is where he gets started with his profound thing, because then he talks about the process.
Yeah.
And that's part of also rationality, valuing the process. So becoming more rational could also make you act more intelligently.
Yeah. So the idea here, when he mentions the initial state and the goal state, because he's given us 4 basic features of this model, which is there's space within which we're searching. There's the initial state and the goal state. Okay, but then there's operators and constraints. Is that right? I got the 4 elements of initial state, goal state, operators, and constraints.
Yes.
With the goal, the overall goal, not the goal state, but the goal in mind being to reduce the difference between those two, the initial state and the goal state. So
and he uses a very simple example of, well, also thirsty. He uses thirsty first, which is then pretty cool, because you need all these different operators. You need to be able to move into the direction. You need to be able to lift your hand, but you also need to know the sequence of events that you need to do it in. Otherwise, it's not going to be successful. But he also mentions my food needs to be cooked. My food is uncooked. That's the initial state. The goal state is cooked food. And there's the rational ways to get to it. And one way that he mentions, which is not that rational, is to set your house on fire. It will cook your food, but that very much explains then the constraints, because you want to also have things in place that keep you from doing things that will, I don't want to solve this problem, he says, to the detriment of my ability to solve multiple other problems, or I will lose my intelligence. So you don't want to ruin everything to get to a specific goal, type of thing. That's not very rational.
Oh, wow. This is very meta, because you can think of it as like the goal of the psychologist in the cognitive sciences is to push their agenda further, whatever, get the funding that they need or whatever. Even because that's not taking into consideration the full picture of cognitive science. And anyway, it was just like a example within that.
I think from my personal life, even, I can think of many examples, unfortunately, where I did not make the rational, where I didn't pay sufficient attention to the constraints. And I simply chose the operator that was easiest and most salient, because salience is actually a big player in the whole bullshit, having your biases direct your course, type of thing, because things are salient that we are biased towards. And so because when he uses the example of setting your house on fire, of course everyone thinks I'm not going to do that, but we do things that's not very rational on a daily basis, unfortunately.
Well, I was thinking about your train track example too, because I don't think you mentioned that one recorded, but yeah, stepping on, or even stepping stones or anything like that, you take, maybe the closest one, but maybe the closest one doesn't take you to the rest of them, and it seemed like a good option to step on that one, but now you're further away from everything. And so yeah, being mindful of which steps you step upon through the whole process and enjoying the process.
Having a view of the process as far as possible, because I mean, We are limited, severely limited as human beings. We don't have a God's eye view, unfortunately, or fortunately, maybe.
Unfortunately, because it'd be overwhelming. Yeah, I mean, that's like the interesting thing about this whole conversation is we're having to reduce the amount of data because there's just so much overwhelming sensory input from the world around us that it's necessary for our little human brains to distill it into something understandable.
We were talking about a God's eye view, God-like perspective. And it's funny because I want to end with something about being divine.
Oh, let's go. I like that.
So the conversation goes on between Meno and Socrates and the other man. And then at a certain point, Socrates says, "Women, you know, Meno, do call good men divine. And the Spartans too, when they are singing a good man's praises, say, he is divine. And it looks as if you were right," Meno says, "though our friend Anytus may be annoyed with you for saying so." Socrates: "I can't help that. We will talk to him some other time. If all we have said in this discussion and the questions we have asked have been right, virtue will be acquired neither by nature nor by teaching. Whoever has it gets it by divine dispensation, without taking thought, unless he be the kind of statesman who can create another like himself. Should there be such a man, so a man who can actually teach virtue, he would be among the living, practically what Homer said of Tiresias was among the dead, when he described him as the only one in the underworld who kept his wits. The others are mere flitting shades. Where virtue is concerned, such a man would be just like that, a solid reality among shadows.
I like that. Solid among shadows.
And is cultivating rationality, isn't that maybe also cultivating virtues and then becoming a solid reality?
Yeah, the symbols, the metaphors are coming in. It's a big cycle. That's what I feel. It's a big cycle. So
that ends the beginning of our description of cognitive science, we should say.
good. Okay, we've got another good 24 episodes to go. Buckle up, stay tuned. See you in the next episode. Mwah.